Should be. Welcome to the Church of Mabus radio show. It's Friday night, 7:02 p.m. Central. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Got Mike Marinacci here with us. How's it going, Mike?
It's going great, Jeffrey. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Doing all right, sort of.
Everything feels crazy as hell more and more every week lately, it seems like, but hanging in there. We got Wham
Hey.
representing. And just energetically, the world just feels crazier every week. Like it's too much at times. There's too much going on.
It's just well, I think it's always probably unraveling, but now we just are seeing all of it unravel. So
yeah, it's painful.
Yeah, it is painful.
And Mike's book is Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. And what was the catalyst for this journey? That's a big one.
Well,
for sure.
It goes all the way back to college when I was a Callow student at UCLA, and for the first time in my life, because I had a rather straight-laced upbringing, started experimenting with cannabis and psilocybin and LSD, and started having really profound experiences. Now, I've been raised secular humanist. I really didn't have any religious background, but in these experiences, I started saying, "Man, this is what I guess they're talking about in all the churches and mosques and temples and whatnot. This holiness, contact with something divine." And I did a little research, and I found out that apparently this is a fairly common experience in human history, that we have religious and spiritual traditions that are based in the use of what we call entheogens that go back thousands and thousands of years. And I started just getting very interested in it in the mid 80s. Now, by that point, of course, we had the whole Reagan-Bush war on drugs going, and the culture around psychedelics had just really gone underground. They were kind of being put by the drug warriors in the same category as cocaine and heroin and whatnot. These are all bad, they're all deadly, et cetera, et cetera. So you really had to dig to get information. And I did find a couple of these groups in North America that were still around, but they were not very forthgoing about their activities. Then by the 90s, things were loosening up a bit. There was kind of a revival of interest in psychedelics and entheogens, with the rave culture, with the beginning of Burning Man, with the McKenna brothers, et cetera, et cetera. And then I started really doing more active research of the whole phenomenon. And then finally, a few years ago, after writing several other books, I said, Mike, you've been fascinated with this thing for decades now. You've got all this information. Nobody else has done a book about it. Why don't you do a book about modern North American religious and spiritual groups that use cannabis or LSD or psilocybin or peyote or other hallucinogenic substances as part of their rituals, as part of their sacred practice. And so was able to land a book contract with Inner Traditions, and I wrote Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. It's been out for I guess a couple of months now, and I'm very pleased at how it turned out. It's really there really is no book out there like it. I really seem to have a lock on this particular subject, and I like that because I really put my heart and soul into it and really dug deep to find these often rather obscure, deliberately so, groups that use entheogenic substances in their practices.
And how did you go about researching each one? I know obviously you do research at home, but did you have to like get close to them or infiltrate them, or most of the research was at home? How did you do? What
I
did you
did
do?
a little bit of participant observer work. I have sat in on a couple of sessions of these groups, and but a lot of it was also on the internet, contacting people, phone interviews, sometimes in-person interviews. Tremendous amount of. I don't know if this book would have been in quite as thick or as detailed or as involved as it is without sources like archive.org or newspapers.com, where you can really dig an incredible amount of information out from the comfort of your own home. So it was really a mixture of getting at primary sources plus old news reports. Underground newspapers are good too. The Voices Reveal Digital project has a lot of them online, and these were often the only places where you could find out about these groups that were active in the 60s. So really, it was years and years of work, and doing while I was busy writing other things or having my day job or living the rest of my life.
Well, let's say for the Native American Church, Trouble and Triumph on the Long Peyote Road, we get into the history of it and everything. I'm just trying to imagine what that must be like and how they went about even establishing that. I mean, what were some of the roadblocks in the history to that?
Well, peyote has been around, at least in North America, at least 7,000 years as used in ritual context. It didn't really get going in the United States and later Canada until the late 19th century, in the wake of the Ghost Dance Rebellion by the Native American nations, which failed miserably and led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I think the indigenous peoples of the Americas were saying, okay, we've lost our old world, we've lost our land, our old ways of doing things. What's next? What will keep us together, and what will sustain us spiritually and give us a vision? And so some of the Plains tribes who had done raids down into Mexico, where peyote was really rooted very heavily in a lot of the Indian nations down there, started using it and started working out rituals for the use of it in community, and it started spreading to other Indian nations. And finally, in the 1910s, James Mooney, who was a white anthropologist who had himself sat in on peyote ceremonies and was sympathetic to the Indians and sympathetic to peyotism, said, look, in the United States, if you can get yourself incorporated as a religious organization, you will get protection under the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of religion. You've got to get this organized and written down and made legal. And so they did that in 1918 in Oklahoma and began to grow. And in a few years, they had about 30 or 40,000 members. The problem was that it was still considered, peyote was still considered kind of this forbidden thing, not only with the white man's government, but in some Native American nations and reservations too, where they said, this isn't part of our tradition. What is this stuff going on? So the Native American church spent almost a century in various courts, federal, state, tribal, whatnot, fighting for their First Amendment rights to use peyote in ceremony. And the two main ceremonies are called Big Moon and Half Moon. And Big Moon is more Christian oriented, and Half Moon is more based on indigenous myth and teachings. And finally, after big court decisions and a lot of struggle, in 1994, the amendments to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Washington said, if you're a registered member, enrolled member of a Native American tribe, you can use peyote in the context of the ceremony of the organized Native American church. So it became legal if you have those statuses in that institution. Now, if you don't, it's a whole other story. I think non-native peoples have known about what we call plant medicines, or these intoxicants for centuries. Scientists, of course, have been interested in them for a long time, and it really really came into popular interest, I think, in the 1950s with the publication of Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, where he discussed his trip on then legal mescaline in great detail and in a very sympathetic and articulate way. Then the whole beatnik subculture sort of glommed onto it. And by the 60s, you started having organizations that were dedicated that said, well, we should be like the Native American Church for non-Native Americans. And so you started having organizations like the Church of the Awakening, or Timothy Leary's League for Spiritual Discovery, or the Neo-American Church or whatnot, kind of popping up and saying, well, we're going to take this to the rest of the world. We are going to make this a religious discipline and a yoga in modern America and Canada. But the problem was they didn't have the status of Native Americans who've been doing this for thousands of years, and whose reservations are semi-autonomous bodies that are governed by different laws and legal bodies than the rest of the U.S. and Canada. And so there was tremendous repression of these groups, lots of court cases, and they went very much underground in the 70s, 80s, as I said before, began to kind of come into revival in the 90s. And now it's funny because I about a year and a half ago was when I delivered the manuscript to the publisher, and just after that, all these new groups started popping up. There's one which I mentioned in the book called the Zydor Church in Oakland and San Francisco, California, which uses psilocybin mushrooms in their worship, and they've been on the front pages of newspapers here and TV shows and whatnot. They've gotten tremendous publicity because of their fairly open and generally tolerated use and distribution of psilocybin to their thousands of members that are enrolled in the church. I talk about them, but I also look more about the history of how it came to be where we are right now, where we've got cannabis legal for all purposes in about half the states in the union, and increasingly psilocybin being looked at as a not only a therapeutic agent, but as a religious sacrament. And there's this big push to decriminalize it in California, in the Pacific Northwest, in other places. I heard Hawaii has a bill right now to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms. We're in quite a different place right now than really the U.S. has been in for at least 100 years, and probably the entire Western world has been in for 1,500 or more, is in accepting these substances as aids to consciousness expansion and spiritual growth, and accepting that there will be organizations that are dedicated to this, where people can come together in community and have these experiences.
Diesel, a co-host of mine, was telling me about some festival that was kind of like mushroom orientated, psychedelic, where I guess people were just doing it. I forget what state it was, but it seemed like a big mushroom party. And he said there was like people with business cards that you can just buy it and they'll mail it, which is probably not legal, but it seems like there's renaissances happening. I forget the name of it, but he's told me about it.
That might have been the Divine Assembly out in Utah. That was an organization that was founded a few years ago by a former Mormon and Utah State Republican legislator who had these life-changing experiences on ayahuasca and psilocybin, and pretty much said, well, this has got to be brought to the rest of the world. And he formed a group called the Divine Assembly. And probably because he's a lawyer and is well connected, I have not heard of him or his followers having any big legal problems, and this is in Utah, no less, which is a fairly conservative, socially conservative state. And they're a very well organized group, and lots of good material they put out. And they have every year they have kind of a miniature sort of Burning Man, spiritual Burning Man for mushrooms. It was first out in the Salt Flats, and now I think they have some private land out in West Utah where they do it. And they're the Divine Assembly. I discuss their history and their activities in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches.
It's definitely fascinating. There's some of them I've heard of, but there's a lot of them I've never heard of. What is you said the Neo-American Church? Who's Chief Boohoo presents massive doses of acid absurdity?
Well,
Chief Boohoo, who's that?
They're one of my favorite groups. Actually, they had a funny parallel development with Timothy Leary's career. Timothy Leary was a very well-respected academic and clinical psychologist. First did psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico in 1960, and it was a life-changing experience, and it just led to him becoming really the most famous entheogenic evangelist in history. Now, a month before he had that first trip, another psychologist in upstate New York named Arthur Klepps ordered some then legal mescaline sulfate from a supply company and took it, and also had a life-changing experience, but kind of waited for a while to really do much with it until he heard that 3 years later that Timothy Leary and his cohorts, who'd been kicked out of Harvard and then Mexico and then a couple of Caribbean island nations, had gotten this commune together, this giant estate in upstate New York called Millbrook, where they were doing LSD, which was still legal then, and doing research on it and seeing how it affected their lives. And he went there and joined them for a while. Didn't get along with most of the people who were living there, so he just split off and formed his own group, which he called the Neo-American Church, as opposed to Native American. Neo-American meaning all of us who showed up here after the Spaniards and the Puritans or whatnot. He really kind of pioneered the whole idea of religion or spirituality as something you don't have to take it 100% seriously. You can be playful about it. I mean, he called the ministers of the church boohoos, and he, of course, was the chief boohoo. The symbol of the church was a three-eyed toad. The church hymns were "Row, row, row your boat, life is but a dream," and "Puff the Magic Dragon." And he had a real interesting philosophy about the whole thing. He called it solipsistic nihilism, and he said that what acid and the other entheogens do is reveal to somebody who is thinking correctly, in his opinion, that life is a dream. We are all experiencing reality, as we call it, as a dream. There's no real externality of relations. This is all happening inside our heads, and then when we die, we're just going from one dream to another dream. And he was just a wild, I would call him the wild man of 60s psychedelia. Very contentious, funny as hell as a writer. Had a lot of weird adventures and a lot of strange personal problems. And the book I described how he really worked alongside Leary at Millbrook and all the craziness that was going on there until they finally got shut down. And then he had eventually moved out to California and came out with got a large chunk of land up in Humboldt County when they were just beginning to start growing sesame up there, and said, we're going to build a psychedelic Disneyland here. We're going to create this whole kind of giant retreat for people to do this stuff. And I get into the story of that in my book as well, about what happened with that. But yeah, he's one of the most interesting characters to me. Very intelligent man, extremely amusing, but kind of hard to get along with. I mean, I interviewed him many years ago, and we kind of butted heads, and then I've heard from just about everybody else who's dealt with him that he was like that. He died in '99, and his wife still runs the church, and they have a free download of his book about Millbrook on their site. The book is just both really hilarious and very informative about that whole scene on the East Coast that was not as nearly discussed nearly as much as, say, San Francisco and the Summer of Love and LA and all that, built around the entheogenic experience.
Well, with me, I grew up with a father that said if I ever did drugs, he'd kill me. So I never did them. But when he died, I turned into like albino Scarface for a few years.
Albino
But,
Scarface.
yeah, I didn't get that crazy, but I got around some people that I shouldn't have and sold and stuff like that. Luckily, didn't hurt anybody like crazy, besides selling them crazy drugs, but like coke and meth and things like that. But now I just got it down to cannabis, so I'm doing pretty damn good. That's what I think.
Same here, pretty much. I mean, most of my real experimentation was in university, and I mean, I was raised by a dad who was a Korean War vet, and he told me the first time he smoked weed was out in the field during the war. In his unit, there was a couple of Latino guys from California. They spotted this plant and said, "Mota, mota." He says, "What's that?" Says, "Oh, here." And they roll it up and smoke it. And he said, "Oh, okay. This is." So I was with, I was in the semi-bohemian kind of family where it was a bit different. They didn't approve of me doing these things, but at least they kind of said, "Yeah, we kind of get it."
Being high in war, like I just couldn't even imagine.
Well, it was because he said to me once, war is 5% pants crapping sheer terror and 95% mind destroying boredom. They were bored, nothing else to do.
Well,
I've heard that. I've heard that about war.
Yeah,
just sitting around waiting for something to happen. And then when something does happen, it's just horrific.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Dreams of nightmares for sure.
Oh yeah.
So with some of these stories, I'm curious. Do you get in? I know you got into some of like the law enforcement reaction to some of these places. Is there a lot of that and like conflict?
Oh yes, very much so. And the laws changed, I think, according to what happened. Now, the real repression of peyote started in the 1890s, but that was kind of it was pretty much local. It was against state law or tribal law or whatever, and there was spotty enforcement. I think the so-called, and that was really the beginning of the war on drugs in the United States, so-called war on drugs. It kind of shifted into a higher gear in the 1930s with the so-called reefer madness, when it became this national campaign to stamp out the production and use of cannabis. And oddly enough, for the next 30 years after the 1937 federal crackdown, or almost 30 years, all of the other psychedelics were legal. LSD, when it first appeared in the late 40s, completely legal. Psilocybin, completely legal. Peyote was kind of in a gray area, but you could buy legal synthetic mescaline. That was fine. Then, when the second great moral panic or maybe the third great moral panic about drugs started in the 60s, about hippies and LSD and whatnot, then they started being made illegal on the federal level, and eventually you had something called Schedule 1, which we still have, which is the list of drugs that are considered absolutely illegal on the federal level, that there's no real use for them seen beyond straight up abuse. And that would be, you have on the one hand, you have cocaine and heroin on there. On the other hand, you have all of the entheogens. So yeah, there was increasing crackdowns as these drugs became illegal, and as there was, I think, both legal and public pressure to just do something about the so-called drug menace. Because again, just like today, just like the last 100 years of our 100 odd years, people throw drugs or chemicals or what have you all under one umbrella. They don't realize that cocaine and heroin and amphetamine and cannabis and LSD are very, very different very, very different chemicals with very different reactions in different people. The only thing they have in common is they're all illegal.
Definitely, and I know they're trying to move cannabis to Schedule 3 or something like that. I've noticed a bunch of articles lately popping up talking about how bad cannabis is. You can see the campaigns, like on MSN News. I don't even read them, but you can tell when they're up to something for sure. They keep popping up lately a lot.
They can be abused. It can be abused like any other chemical, and I think generally what they're talking about is people that abuse it. People that do too much of it. And I think there's also some people out there who should not have no business doing it. People with schizophrenia, people with other psychological disturbances. Yeah, it's not a good idea. But I think generally it's probably the least harmful of all what we would call drugs or intoxicants, including alcohol.
Oh, I mean, alcohol is like one of the most dangerous things, especially when you abuse it. It's it destroys the body, and tobacco. I mean, please.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. It's, and I say that as a social drinker. But it's, I think a lot of it is just because fear too. People are afraid a lot of the time there's a lot of free floating fear going around there, and they want to have something to kind of. And there are some really, really dangerous chemicals out there. I mean, I live just north of San Francisco. I live in Marin County, and what fentanyl has done to San Francisco and to other big cities and small towns like around America is just devastating. But this is again, this is a very, very different thing from an entheogen.
Right. Well, I mean, I liked your book a lot. I have a background in religious studies, in particular new religious movements in the United States. And so I enjoyed, learning about groups that, I mean, some of them I'd heard of, some of them I hadn't, so it's always nice hearing about all of the pollinizations of things that go on in the alternative religion community. And oddly enough, I've also, and this was not something I was an expert in, but I was asked at a certain point, because I have a background in the social sciences, to teach at a community college that I used to work at, teach a class on the sociological history of drug use and abuse in the United States. And it was supposed to be like a foundation course for people who were going to be going into, like counseling or social work or something like that. But what it really was kind of a sociological historical survey of drug legislation in the United States. And the thing that, I mean, you talk about fear. Well, if you go back in the history, and I'm sure you know some of this, you just haven't mentioned it, but if you go back in the history of, say, marijuana, for example, or heroin, those are the two that I think of the most. When you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when both of those substances were legal, there was a protracted series of very deliberate political, I don't know what you call it, impulses, if you will, to link those substances very specifically with certain social, economic, and racial groups.
Oh, absolutely.
And that was used to inflame public opinion about these particular substances. And so to me, it's like that was always sort of a revelation to my students, the connection, the ongoing connection between substance use. And you do talk about this, especially with regard to indigenous people, because indigenous people in North America have used these substances forever, actually, all people have used substances forever, but
Yes.
indigenous people have used these substances forever. And so part of the attempts to make certain things illegal were also attempts to simply control these particular groups and take them away. Demonize them, take them away from their cultural and religious practices, and certainly when it came to marijuana, I mean, if you and I didn't see the reference, but I read your book quickly. I'm sure that you referenced that piece of political propaganda that was done in the 1940s, I believe it was, by the government, Reefer Madness, which very specifically links marijuana use to, jazz clubs and with the racial element there. And the whole thing is, if you smoke marijuana, you'll turn into this murderous, crazy person. It's just bizarre. I used to have my students in the class, watch that. It's only about an hour long, and we watch that. And then we discuss it, and we talk about, okay, what stereotypes from this movie still exist for drug users. I mean, seriously, and it's really, and then when you get to the demonizing of hallucinogens, I mean, it's pretty clear, and there's pretty good evidence for it, that one of the big reasons for it, and linking it to the hippies, and this counterculture, as you said, the whole idea of the counterculture was sort of created. Was one of the advisors to Nixon basically said it. We can't just openly shoot black people or hippies. So we're going to demonize this thing so that we can smear them with it.
Yeah.
And so that's so there's a huge political thing, and ironically at the same time, and my students always saw this. At the very same time that these drugs are being demonized, there's this growth of these synthetic psychotropic drugs, from the 20s and 30s that are being pushed, like Valium, and that are being pushed, to treat mental illness or to calm people down, like to calm housewives down in the 1950s and 1960s. And so now we have this whole thing where we have this really kind of weird mix of, you've got Big Pharma, who basically created the opioid crisis that we have, by creating synthetic opioids. And pushing them on people. Yeah. And so you have this pharmacological industry. It's part of the medical industry, but then you have these drugs that have always been here that can really help people if you use them correctly. I do think if you use them in a thoughtful, controlled way. I mean, I know I used psilocybin several times during a really difficult part of my life, and it really helped.
Yeah. If I could just interject here.
Sure.
I would also add to your, I think, accurate description of the demonizing campaigns around, say, cannabis. Yeah. I would add to that even alcohol prohibition was like
Absolutely.
that. Absolutely. Identified with these dirty, drunken Irish and Italian and Slavic immigrants who, they're just messing up our country. It's because of the booze they drink. We don't want to be like them.
Absolutely.
And of course, later with cannabis, it was blacks and Latinos.
Mexicans.
And I would agree with you also as far as these substances being very useful and healing if they are taken mindfully and in proper supervision in a proper environment. Exactly. I always liked what Timothy Leary once said about setting, and dosage. Those are the things you've got to be conscious of when you were doing an entheogens. Set is what's in here. What mood are you in? What's going through your life? What are you trying to get out of this experience? Where are you going with it? Setting is the outside. Where are you in time and space? What's around you? Who's around you? What's happening around you? And then, of course, dosage. What are you using and how much of it? And is it pure? And how pure is it? How sure are you that you're getting the real thing?
Right.
I think those are absolutely vital to touch any of the substances, including cannabis.
Right. I agree completely.
Yeah,
I mean, it's, I mean, when I would always start the class, I would always say there are two main things that have happened with natural drugs and that have sort of changed how we in the West are impacted by them, because people have always used drugs.
Yeah.
People have always used mind-altering substances, and we're not the only creatures who do. Lots of other animals use mind-altering substances too,
or produce them, like blue the southwestern toad, which you can get DMT from.
Right, exactly. But there were always two things that if you just kind of look at the history in the West, what we've done is we've taken a lot of natural substances, whether they're alcohol or whether it's like a natural ephedra, or whether it's morphine, the natural opium to morphine. And what we've done is we've concentrated it and made it stronger, or synthesized it, changed it in some way, that they created heroin in order to try and advertised it in the 1890s as a synthetic that was less addictive than morphine, which of course now is hilarious to us. So that's one thing that we did. We used our Western technology to try to, we even hybridized tobacco in order to concentrate the amount of nicotine in tobacco leaves. And the other thing that we did was that we often removed many of these substances from traditional spiritual and medical contexts. We just pulled them out of them.
Tobacco, for example?
And tobacco, absolutely. Tobacco, but also cocaine, the original coca, and a lot of other drugs too, that we just, for example, ephedra has been used, for thousands of years in Central Asia and in Chinese medicine in a natural tea form, and usually in combination with other things to get a very specific effect. But we've taken that molecule, and you can cook it up and you can make it meth. It's like it's kind of nuts.
One thing I saw was up in Canada. I've had some friends show me all these weird sites up there that have sprung up. They're synthetic, like DMT or that toad stuff, and it's like they have menus, and I guess it's legal there. I don't know, but
it's not really legal. It's right now. I think the law is looking the other way in most of these places, in the big cities anyway, Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal.
Yeah,
I think if so long as they're selling to adults and they don't really push it, the law tends to look the other way. And that reminds me of another thing in my book, which is the Temple of the True Inner Light, which is an organization based in New York City. And for quite a few years in the late 80s and the early 90s, they were operating very openly on the streets of New York with a storefront church in the Lower East Side, and were distributing DPT, which is a chemical relative of DMT, to anybody that wanted to come in and take communion with them. And they got away with it, number one, because it was technically legal, although not really approved by the DEA or the FDA or whatnot. Number two, because this is New York City and the cops were so busy trying to bust heroin and cocaine runners that they figured, oh, here's a few crazy hippies over here smoking this weird substance. Well, so long as they don't, attack anybody in the streets, this is not our concern. It's that kind of dynamic. But I also wanted to address something that Wham said about the ironic thing about the Western science and technology and the sort of concentration of the active ingredients and taking them away from the plant sources, is that if you've ever read Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key, he makes a very good case that what we call Western civilization began with the uses of entheogenic substances. That the ancient Hebrews were brewing beer and wine that had psychoactive elements in it. That the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, they were probably using ergot mold dissolved in water, and of course ergot is the organic precursor of LSD. That the Romans were doing all these strange things, and they survived after the triumph of Christianity and the fall of Rome. They survived among the Strega, the witches of southern Italy, who used these potions for visions or for healing or for whatnot. So it's I would say it's really more of kind of an industrial revolution thing. Everything had to be organized and controlled, made as efficient as possible. And I mean, thank God for the Industrial Revolution. We live a lot better, but it has a price on it as well in terms of what it did to our minds and our souls.
So all these organizations stay pretty level-headed. None of them went Heaven's Gate or anything. Was it all pretty peaceful because of the drugs? Or
pretty much. I think it's because it's underground to begin with, and there's not much money to be made. Although there are organizations that are popping up right now that. And I discuss a couple of them in the book that have these very expensive retreats out to South America where you can legally do ayahuasca, and others that are doing this with magic mushrooms. Somebody once asked me, well, why didn't you put the Manson family in there? I mean, they were using drugs, and it was this kind of spiritual cult where they were expanding their minds and having all these fantasies. So I said, no. The Manson family was not a religious cult. It was a criminal organization disguised as a hippie commune. They made their money from dealing drugs and stealing automobiles, and the killings that they did were all about drug trade gone bad. This helter-skelter stuff that Bugliosi started, all these things, that's BS. These were criminals and drug traffickers. And Manson, if anything, had a lot less power than somebody like Tex Watson, who actually organized the girls and went out and did the 2 nights of killings. But it gets back to, as far as them being dangerous, yeah, as I said earlier, these substances can be abused. There are abusive spiritual leaders out there who I think would take advantage of these. And I think the more above ground this sort of stuff is, the more people know about it, and the more sophisticated they are about both the nature of the spiritual experience and entheogens, the less potential there will be for unscrupulous people to exploit them in these ways. The less potential there will be to have smaller versions of Heaven's Gate or Jonestown or whatnot. And you want to talk about trying to rape people's minds with these. Well, that goes back to the CIA and MK Ultra and all this thing. When LSD was first invented, they bought up the world supply at one point because they thought that they could use lysergic acid to program people to do whatever they wanted to do, whether that would be carry documents or whack some foreign national. And they gave up on it after a while because they could not control the experience. I always like what Hunter Thompson said about LSD. It's too small to see and too big to control. So if anybody wants to talk about it, I said, well, our own government for many years was doing just that, was doing this kind of very irresponsible and destructive and cruel manipulation of people with these drugs. So they're really in no position to talk about it, to criticize it, because this was Cold War policy for years. On the down low, certainly. We didn't really find out about it until the mid-'70s, but still.
Yep. I know a woman. I haven't been in touch with her for a while. I've talked about her briefly a couple times on the show. I don't know if she is still doing this, but for much of her life, she has been employed I mean, she's done other things in her life, but she has been employed in an unofficial capacity by researchers who are connected to the military or connected to the intelligence services, because each service of the military has their own intelligence service.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And their own kind of,
Yeah, I know a guy who was in Air Force intelligence for many years.
Right. But she has, she's been a person who has been willing to be provided with small amounts of various substances and to take them and to record their effects for these federal organizations who are studying these things. And the studies have been ongoing. Mm-hmm. And the last time I talked to her, which was just a few years ago, she was still doing it, and she'd been doing it for, oh God, I don't know, 50 years or something.
Wow.
For a long time, off and on. I mean, what they do apparently is that they'll give you certain types of substances, and you take them and you record your experiences, and then they have to wait sometimes to kind of get the body completely out of the system, depending on what the substance is. And but she's been doing this like for decades, and she believes very strongly that certain types of substances, especially substances that are connected to like mushrooms, mm-hmm. Or fungi, are a way by which these are chemicals, so they're a way by which certain organisms communicate and might even communicate to us. Yeah. And as a result of some of her experiences, she actually developed this really interesting alphabet, this language, and that's called WAVE. And she's written a couple of books about, one's fiction, one is her dissertation. She wrote a dissertation on this, where she actually talks about the consciousness language that she received from a certain type of psilocybin. And she believes that these substances are a way in which we could communicate with other life forms on the planet, especially fungi. She has a fondness for fungi, but it's interesting. I mean, some of what she describes is really fascinating. This experimentation is still going on. It's just at a very low, it's at a very controlled level. You know what I mean?
Yeah. They're not doing like what MK Ultra was doing and dosing guys before they went into a horror house and then watching them with the girls from a one-way mirror and crazy stuff like that.
Right. Exactly.
Some of my experiences with UFO stuff, I was on psychedelics, and there were witnesses there that were not on psychedelics that saw the stuff as well that was there. So there's definitely something shamanic about that for sure. It's like a telephone on a lot of different levels.
Yeah.
And that's pretty. Go ahead.
A friend of mine, Adam Go Rightly, well, that's his pen name. Mm-hmm. He first got interested in things paranormal when he was a teenager and did acid and started seeing UFOs. And he could tell these were not, it was more than hallucinations. He was manifesting something. And he got very intrigued and has been pretty much spent his life as a researcher and author on subjects of the paranormal and the odd, and also unusual spiritual paths. It's reminded me of that.
There's definitely a connection to it for sure. Opening your senses, and definitely that's the whole reason is mine. It's a lot of my stuff happened after I had testicular cancer, and then my dad died, and then I started experimenting and doing all kinds of stuff, reading different occult stuff, and it attracted a lot of different things that were UFO-like and beings of light, native spirits, things like that, and between the suffering and the just the loss, it
Yeah.
opens you up. There's
Mhm.
there's a connection to that as well, for sure.
Very much so. Yeah. That's just, I always like what Robert Anton Wilson called a chapel perilous, which is just kind of being cut from your normal moorings and then just going into a place where all the old definitions are gone. And you've got to figure out, okay, how am I going to define where I'm going? The new parameters of my life and the new parameters of how I perceive everything. And he once said you have a tendency to come out of it either enlightened or completely paranoid. It's and luckily I came out. I don't know if I'd call it enlightened, but I came out, I think, a better person and a more, have a better perception of things. But I've seen the ones that don't come out that way, and yeah, it's and that can go beyond, I think, just entheogens. That can be any kind of religious or spiritual awakening or PTSD. It's we're meant to be reprogrammed. It's just how is it going to be done, and what is the new program going to be, and what are you going to do with that new program?
Yeah, and often the context too with it. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I noticed the Hawaiian Cannabis Ministry, Holy Smoke in Paradise. Someone gave me some Dutch Hawaiian weed recently, so I think I'm already going there. It's one of my favorites, grown in Hawaii. But what's the story behind that?
Oh, well, that's actually one of my favorite living people in the book is Roger Christie. Now, Roger Christie was a soldier in Vietnam. He was actually being trained for intelligence duties, but at the same time he was smoking weed, which he'd done since his late teens, and then finally just told the Army, I can't fight on the behalf of this government. I think the war is wrong, in Vietnam is wrong. I can't bear arms. And very, in a very disciplined and step-by-step manner, he was able to get a conscientious objector deferment, which so many people at the time wanted in Vietnam, but he actually was able to pull it off. He became a commercial pilot, settled in Hawaii, and became kind of one of the early promoters of the whole hemp industry there, making clothes and other things out of non-psychoactive cannabis, vegetable matter. Then he discovered religious science, which is sort of an outgrowth of some of the new thought movements of the 19th century, and got involved with a group called the Religion of Jesus Church, which was a church that had started in California in the late 60s and early 70s, based on this ritual consumption of cannabis and reading of the Urantia book, which is a sort of what I would call as a fanfic Bible.
Yeah, it's a fanfic Bible of the total bureaucracy of the universe.
It's a strange book. Martin Gardner, who's a famous skeptic, wrote a pretty good book about it. And and then finally he formed his own group called the Hawaiian Cannabis THC Ministry, and they were dedicated largely to not only cannabis as a spiritual pursuit, but it as a healing pursuit. Since Hawaii had just legalized medicinal marijuana. The problem is that Hawaii had not approved any of the infrastructure that would need. We still couldn't grow it. We still couldn't distribute it. Cannabis patients could not be instructed on how to use it or grow it. And the whole thing was being done through their state police, I believe, rather than through their state health department. And so he created this kind of through the church, this sort of underground network of people who were using it to supply it to medical cannabis users, and also to start this kind of spiritual discipline around it that from what I've read and seen of his own work is very positive and very life-giving, non-authoritarian. And as a result of him, I think I get into it in the book about why I think he got busted by the feds, but he ended up doing, I think, almost 4 years in federal lockup with no trial, no ability to visit anybody from the outside world. He wasn't even let out of a building in like four years of artificial light, and was, I think, one of the movement's real martyrs in that sense. And he and his wife finally, who also did some time, finally got out. And I haven't spoken to him lately, but last I heard was that he's getting a bit on in age, and somebody else, I think, is reviving the THC ministry there, and is kind of following in his footsteps to just really get it going through Hawaii and through the rest of the world, and with the message about the spiritual and medicinal healing aspects of cannabis.
I know that movie. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I said go ahead. I said, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say again, Roger Christie to me is one of the real good figures in the book. I mean, a real stand-up guy. I've talked to him on the phone. I have an invite to go see him out in Hawaii. And this is a man who really suffered, I think, for his advocacy of the herb. Another group I get into, of religious cannabis groups that where their people really had to do some hard time, would be the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church. Now, we've all heard of Rastafarianism.
Yes.
The EZCC, which began in Jamaica, was really an attempt to bring people outside of the New World African diaspora into Rasta, white people and otherwise, and have the same teachings and the same disciplines and whatnot. And they eventually, a lot of their people who were Americans all settled in Florida, and they became a huge marijuana smuggling operation in the 1970s. They made millions of dollars, and their whole embassy was this lavish estate on a key near Miami Beach. And finally, and I get into in the book about what happened to them, is they really got stomped on because they were like Roger, a little too public about what they were doing, and were getting too wealthy and too influential. And they're still around today, but in a very, very I wouldn't say underground, but just kind of a discreet, quiet form. A man named Carl Olson, who was involved with them in the old days and lives in Iowa, kind of keeps it going these days, and he's still an activist and still promoting their beliefs.
I know that Martin Scorsese movie Killers of the Flower Moon's coming out soon, and I want to see it. I have the book, but I've never got around to reading it. But yes. I'm curious on a level that what the natives have gone through so much from getting harassed for all this stuff by the white man.
Yeah,
for sure. And I know that comes out in October, that Scorsese movie. Looking forward to that for sure.
Same here, yes.
And I want to see Napoleon. He looks like Napoleon, Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah. I'm still getting over Beau Was Afraid. I still don't know what the hell happened to that movie, and I'm psychologically traumatized from it. It was one of those Ari Aster movies. The guy that did Hereditary and Midsommar. It's called Beau Was Afraid.
Oh yeah, Midsommar was a trip.
Yeah,
and then of course, you mentioned Joaquin Phoenix, and I just thought the Joker was incredible. I mean, I'm somebody who cannot stand superhero stuff. That whole aesthetic, that whole thing around it. But they took a villain from that world and just made this amazing character out of him. A character that even as evil and as violent, as messed up as he is, you understand him and you begin to sympathize with him almost. So yeah, I was blown away by that movie.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the sequel of it and everything. And that Joker's the trickster energy. It's pretty much.
Oh yes, very much so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a good show that kind of makes fun of all that superhero stuff, but it's still superheroes. It's called The Boys on Amazon, and Seth Rogen's involved. It's from a Garth Ennis comic, but it's kind of, it's not your normal superhero. If you want something that's definitely, there's like Nazi super soldiers.
Yeah.
There's one scene where a little superhero shrinks into a little man and runs up a man's penis and enlarges himself and blows him up. So it's not your normal everyday.
Better than Viagra, yes.
Yeah. But what else do we know about some of the native stuff? Is there any stories that stand out that you can share about some of it?
I really, of course, the first chapter in the book is about the Native American Church, and I believe it's the longest chapter. And of course, as far as indigenous people, of course, Maria Sabina, the Mazatec Indian curandera, was the person who introduced the rest of the world to psilocybin through R. Gordon and Valentina Wasson, who went down there in the mid-50s and brought the fungi back to the rest of the world. And then, of course, more recently, we have had the whole boom in ayahuasca. And that basically, ayahuasca is a tea made of 2 psychoactive herbs that are found in South America, very heavily laden with DMT. And then there's some other things that interact with it. And this has just become almost mainstream. The number of people, celebrities and people who said, oh, yeah, I've sat with ayahuasca, I had the whole experience and the crazy visions and being almost in this other universe. And in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, I look at the best known and in many ways most controversial of all the organized groups that do work with ayahuasca, and that would be Trinity de Guzman's ayahuasca healings. At one point, these days they do most of their work down in Mexico and Peru, but at one point they were convinced that it was about to become absolutely illegal in America. So they started having retreats in Washington State. And in the book, I talk about what those were like and the controversies around those. And, the whole way this very young guy, who was just in his mid-20s at the time, made this immense footprint on the world of psychedelics, the world of entheogenic spirituality. So yeah, that's another great contribution of indigenous New World peoples is the ayahuasca brew, and we're seeing the manifestation of it today with all of these groups and individuals promoting it.
I like DMT. It's short.
They used to call it, back in the old days, they called it the businessman's trip because you could have a nice trip on your lunch break.
And that's the same thing I heard about it, and I was thinking that same exact thing that you just said right then. It's called the businessman's acid trip. It's short. The other one's about you freak out, think you're going to die around the 8th hour. Been there. I like the short one. In Canada, you can get like a DMT pin. Sounds like they sell this stuff on the side of the road.
You can do that here too if you know the right people. Again, it's just so much of this stuff is in a gray area. I mean, for years, even during the war on drugs in the 80s, you could order psilocybin spores. Now, I think it was that the spores were not really prohibited. It was letting them fruit into actual psilocybin mushrooms, and you'd get in trouble.
I've seen that in High Times magazine.
Back in the old days,
I've seen them not too long ago.
Yeah.
Maybe a few years. I'm not sure the details. I didn't order them, obviously, but
it's so much of this stuff is in a gray area right now, and I think for a lot of just like I mentioned earlier, the example of the DPT, the storefront TPT church in New York City that got away with it for many years. Now it's on a national level. I think that the actual people in charge of enforcing it, the DEA and state and county and local law enforcement, are so busy with things like trying to stop fentanyl, trying to stop crack, whatever, that unless there's a real bad situation, or unless kids are getting it, or if it's really out there in the open, I think they just deprioritize it. And really, that's what so many of these decriminalization efforts around here are about. Is you look at the wording of the law, the laws that have been passed in places like Oakland and certain places in Oregon, they say this would be the lowest priority for law enforcement to be looking at this sort of stuff. Not that it's going to be legal, but that law enforcement is just going to look the other way. That they have much more important things to deal with. That seems to be kind of the rationale behind the changing laws, the changing practices around psilocybin. And I think it may start spreading to things like MDMA, ecstasy, or acid. I mean, I did acid twice many years ago, and then I've never touched MDMA because I just don't trust the purity of the chemicals. It's not like in the early and mid '60s when Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland was producing all these things, and they had state-of-the-art equipment and brilliant chemists doing all this stuff. I don't trust synthetics now. I don't recommend anybody doing anything, or I don't advocate that. But I say if you must, I would advocate something like psilocybin because at least you know what you're getting there. And
right. Right.
Cannabis, peyote. Well, but then I have feelings about peyote. I mean, I don't really get into it in the book, but I really think that because of the incredible struggles that the Native American Church has been through over the last 100-odd years of its existence, it probably should just be reserved for their use and their use only. If you want to have organic mescaline, well, the San Pedro cactus is a good and legal source of it. I don't really want to go beyond that. So it's a lot to think about, and we're really coming into a real kind of strange time with all this stuff because it is becoming so nearing mainstream respectability, and the laws are changing and the attitudes are changing, and there is still the possibility, and I mentioned it in the book, that there could be some big neo-prohibitionist backlash, which wipes out the progress of the last few years or last 30 years or whatnot in this area. But barring that, I think this is just going to get closer and closer to the mainstream and become more and more an acceptable spiritual and medicinal practice.
I had a run-in with kratom and had to finally quit it. And now it's a weird one. Have you ever heard of that? That's legal here in Florida, and you can buy it like at stores with signs and stuff. Yeah. But the weird thing about it is it does feel like painkillers. Finally, I quit doing it. I feel better than I did. I tried it a few times, and it's okay, but it didn't put a hook in me. Thank God. I don't have an addictive personality. I mean, I've tried just about everything there is, short of heroin and crack, and I stick with these days. At my old age, I like having occasionally some cannabis and occasionally some beer. But there's other people out there. They get on something, and it's the monkey is on their back right away, and it's just, again, with more study of these substances and their effect on human beings, will, I think, be able to predict these things and control them and deal with destructive addiction in a better way than just locking people up and demonizing them and the substances. And I would have had an opportunity to do the toad stuff, but I watched videos of other people do it, and I was like, no, thank you. I think I'll pass on that one. I'm not ended up in the emergency room.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Well, what they say now is earlier I kind of stumbled over trying to say the name. Now I know it. Bufo alvarius, which is the southwestern desert toad that produces bufotenin. There are laws against taking them away from the desert or messing with them. And now they say you can get pretty much the same thing in other sources and just leave the toads alone. And the toads are mainly just almost symbols of the silliness and weirdness of the animal and plant world and the trips we can have from them. But I would like to try to, if for nothing else, to just, because I once said, if it was good enough for Mike Tyson, it's good enough for me.
The videos I saw was like people screaming and crying, like a horror movie.
Wow.
It was like, but
Setting
other
and
people had
dosage.
different. It depends on who you're with.
Yeah, setting and dosage. I'm sure somebody like Tyson got it from, real reputable people and had, people around him watching him and all that. It was, I remember that once Timothy Leary, who I actually met a couple of times in the early 90s, was talking about why LSD was made illegal. And he says, well, when we first were doing it, we were doing it in very controlled environments, and we were scientists and psychologists and artists and, the cream of society. You had, this is how the Hitchcock siblings, who were the heirs of the Mellon billionaire family, were very heavily involved in. They were the ones that got Millbrook for Tim and the other people. He says, when we're doing it, it's one thing. When it's somebody who's just doing it for kicks, who's not educated, who's not disciplined, who maybe has some problems up here, pre-existing problems up here that they're running away from, you're going to have a very different effect. And you multiply that times the thousands or millions of people, it does become a problem. And this is where, again, we come back to the sacred aspect of it, that these can be medicines, but they are also sacraments. This is something you do not take lightly. I've gotten in trouble with telling people, hey, I'm kind of glad psilocybin is more available these days, but don't use it as a party drug. You can, this is a little more serious than that. And again, when something is considered sacred and a vehicle and a means to reach a place of numinosity, of a sacred experience, you will maybe take it a little more seriously and not, maybe have the cavalier attitude that so many people unfortunately have towards these things. That creates real problems.
It's weird here with Florida medicinal. And now Alabama's getting it. It is expensive to keep up with it. I have two people I live with. I don't do it. They do it, but I benefit from it. Because you have to pay like crazy fines like every 6 months.
Oh yeah.
It's expensive.
It's the state that Caesar's got to be rendered unto, and it's one of the people I talk about in my book was actually in Georgia running a medicinal cannabis oil operation there that was also a church. He was a former Anglican priest named Gregory Davis, and he set up an organization called the Universal Orthodox Church and clothed himself as an Eastern Orthodox bishop with the robes and the particular hat they wear and all that stuff, and was a real interesting guy. He just died last year. But yeah, it was.
That's my stomping grounds.
Yeah. You're old. So even in the Peach State, it's beginning to make inroads, and it's so. If you read the book, you can read about Gregory Davis.
I don't think Georgia's got anything legalized yet. I'm sure they will eventually.
Yeah.
Especially if Alabama's doing it. I never thought Alabama would do it. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, way back when I was a younger man, and California was about to legalize it for medicinal purposes, I said, well, the anti-prohibitionists, the pro-legalization people, I said they finally found the chink in the armor. They found the Achilles heel, and that's medicine. They said, okay, you're selling this to the voters out there. Well, you've got the baby boomers. For probably the majority of them, they may not do weed anymore, but it's no big deal. They know what it's about. And then to the older people, the silent generation and your World War II greatest generation people, they're old. They're sick. They're in pain. They want something that will help them deal with all the bad stuff that comes with aging. And it is, and if it is a medicine, it's seen as a medicine, as legitimate medicine with these legitimate uses, yeah, they'll, enough of them will go for it too, where you will be able to pass this legislation. So I think that's a big part of it too. I think it's just now people are finally realizing, yes, it does. Aside from the recreational or the spiritual or the industrial uses of cannabis, it does have some very good medicinal applications. I don't think it's a cure-all like some of the more enthusiastic people do in that world, but there's definitely some very, there's definitely applications there that are legitimate.
Definitely. Someone mentioned Carlos Castaneda and the Don Juan books. Those are great books. A long time ago, I interviewed someone named Amy Wallace, who has a book called Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Oh, yes.
Which is about a lot of abuse that got pretty crazy. But I interviewed her a long time ago. If you want to look up that book, it's called Sorcerer's Apprentice. That definitely shed some weird light on that one, for sure.
He had a strange little scene going on around his life with his witches and whatnot. And I always say that Castaneda was one of the people that really popularized these entheogens, as peyote and psilocybin and whatnot. Although I think his books have been pretty heavily and pretty thoroughly debunked by other archaeologists, not archaeologists, anthropologists. There's a lot of truth in the first one, but I think as he went on the series, he just got more and more fanciful. And no, these are not things that the Yaqui Indians do. This is not a real practice. He didn't really experience this. It's a little bit of his imagination running wild. But yeah, as a cultural figure, quite important as far as just getting the word out there about the what are called the plant teachers. N. Scott Mobiday, who was a Kiowa Indian author, got the Pulitzer Prize for his 1968 novel, House Made of Dawn. And there's a scene in that novel where a bunch of urban dwelling Native Americans are having a peyote meeting at somebody's house there, which is very untraditional. You're supposed to have it on the res, on the land, either in a teepee or a hogan or something like that. But again, that was kind of the popular culture noticing this stuff and it being kind of getting in there as well. This is a legitimate thing. This is at least among the indigenous peoples of North America.
Definitely some fascinating things. What have we mentioned? The Oklevueha Native American Church bringing
yes,
white man.
Well, James Mooney, who founded it, and it's funny because he has not only the same name as the white anthropologist who really got the Native American Church going over 100 years ago, but he claims descent from him. He is I get into him in the book, and he is probably the most successful entheogenic church planter of all time. At one point, under the ONAC banner, they had several hundred local chapters. He set it up. He really saw what he was doing, and I get into his biography and his ups and downs of his life and relationship with peyote and other entheogens in the book. He saw it as a great healing. He was tasked to heal the rest of the world and to bring these medicines to the white man. Now, this really got him in trouble with the regular Native American church, who said, hey, we fought 100 years to be able to use this stuff. And the courts have had all sorts of problems. This should be Indians only. And they also got ticked off at him because he started saying, well, we've got peyote, but then the Huichol Indians down there, they use cannabis in their ceremonies too. And so the other Indians down there use psilocybin. Maybe we should extend this to all entheogenic plants as healing plants in our practices, and that got him in a lot of trouble as well. But he, I think, and he admitted it actually to me, that he was so enthusiastic about getting it out there and opening up local branches of it, that he didn't realize that a lot of people who were opening these branches were scam artists and troublemakers. And I get into all of the problems that the local branches had in there. In the book, there were shootouts with the law enforcement. Somebody died in the ceremony once. There's a whole thing about temples of sexual healing in there that somebody set up under the ONAC aegis, and he's really had to pull it back. And now he's kind of an emeritus. He's not actually running the church anymore. But I talked to him for several hours on a Zoom chat. Very interesting guy, quite a life, and I think very sincere about what he did. And in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, I think it's the first time, as with many other organizations, it's the first time that the whole story of this organization is told, and it's a fascinating one to me. And it's, but in the book, there's basically 18 what I call major groups. They're portrayed in long chapters, and then there's about 50 minor ones that are in part 2. And most of the stuff has never been put in book form before. I really had to dig deep into scientific journals and obscure underground papers from the 60s and the reminiscences of people, of their adventures in these days, and finding getting in touch with very underground organizations and winning their confidence to be able to talk about what I talk about in the book. So it's, I'm very, if I should say so, I'm very proud of my accomplishment here. I think it's easily the best book I've ever written, and I think it's the book for anybody who is interested in this aspect of the psychedelic or entheogenic experience, the sacred aspect, and how these communities have come together in our modern world, in modern North America.
Jeffrey, you're muted if you're talking.
Oh, sorry. I sneezed and I forgot.
Oh, okay. That's what sneezed.
I was like, where the hell are you?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of Richard Allen Miller? He says he's one of Timothy Leary's students.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He wrote a book called The Magical and Ritual Use of Herbs.
I've had him on. He's a trip for sure. Yeah. It's a good interview, but some wild stuff. He reminds me of the scientist from Rick and Morty, Rick.
Well, there's quite a few people like that in my book, and there's and some of them they just where they take their experience and where they take their practices goes into some very interesting areas. One of the people I discuss in the book is the Reverend Ann Armstrong of the Healing Church in Providence, Rhode Island. Her backstory basically is she was raised in a Jewish family, and by the way, Lashana Tova to the faithful out there, Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year.
Yeah, she was, and then she converted to Christianity as an adult, and then converted to Roman Catholicism. But she was also a great believer in the healing power of cannabis and the power of cannabis to expand one's spiritual consciousness. And so she formed a group called the Healing Church with a man who's an attorney and also a Jew who converted to Christianity, Alan Gordon. And they see themselves as really, we're not really a separate church. We're an apostolate of the Roman Catholic Church. We just have a very special mission here to bring, and they claim that through, like the medieval church endorsed, through Hildegard of Bingen and a couple of the popes actually endorsed cannabis as a medicine. They said, we want to bring it back. We want to have this out there as a part of our practice as Roman Catholics. And they've done some pretty crazy stuff. having public ceremonies where they will both blow the shofar that has been they'll blow cannabis smoke through the shofar, which is of course the Jewish ritual ram's horn, and then also distribute. And then I know that Roger Christie of THC Ministry did do this too. Distribute cannabis oil and then mark people on the forehead and on other parts of the body with it so that it can be absorbed. Again, it really runs, as far as the spiritual practice of these groups, runs the gamut from them through the more indigenous practices, through somebody like Art Clef's in the New American Church, where it's just this very idiosyncratic vision of spirituality. And then on the other end, you have one of my favorite groups, the Psychedelic Venus Church. They were around in the late 60s and early 70s in the Bay Area. I know the founder. He passed on a few years ago. He was also, his name was Jefferson Poland. He was also years earlier, he'd been the founder of the Sexual Freedom League. And this is just a guy who had his fingers in so many new left and hippie counterculture pies, it's not funny. And he founded the Psychedelic Venus Church basically for the worship of the goddess in the form of Venus or Aphrodite or Kali or Peyote woman or whatever, through ritual cannabis use, and also I think through more down low use of stronger entheogens, and also through body freedom, through public nudity, and through having sacred sex practices, quasi-tantric practices. And that chapter was fun to write because there's just so many stories about them and the wild stuff that they would do. And I'm really surprised that nobody has tried to revive it, because it just seems like such a potent combination of entheogenic mind expansion and growth of consciousness and spirituality through tantric or body honoring practices. So yeah, you really have the gamut with all of the groups I go into in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, as far as, okay, they have this experience. Well, how are they going to express it? How is it going to be done in a communal setting? And what mythos or what theology or what philosophy or what practices are they going to make to kind of contain the entheogenic experience and define it and give it more meaning?
It's definitely fascinating. What was the Church of Naturalism and tie into LA murders?
Yeah, well, I don't want to give away too much about that because I want people to buy the book and read it. But that was one that I just stumbled onto. Very obscure organization, and I dug up what I could about it. And basically, that was an organization started by a rather enigmatic man named George Peters. Now, right there, if you're a reader of novels and a literate American, that should bring up a red flag for you, because George Peters was the fake name that Huckleberry Finn went by in the book. So, and this guy also claimed, well, yeah, I was in the Navy in the 50s and we were using we were using LSD then. Another red flag. Other things about him suggest he probably was obscure about what his background for some very good reasons. But he formed a group called Naturalism Incorporated, which was one of the early crisis intervention organizations dedicated to people who were having bad trips on acid or other things in Chicago. He became very well known around there. I mean, this was many years before, like the Do It Now Foundation in the 70s, or Dance Safe and the other groups we have now, which deal with people who are having problems with ecstasy or whatnot. And it eventually turned into a religious organization. And they never really officially endorsed LSD and other things, but it was pretty obvious they were being used there. And the whole thing came to a very weird and bad and violent end when they moved to Los Angeles. And I get into that in the book, and the parallels between what they were doing and what their fate was, and the parallels between them and what was called the Wonderland murders in also in Laurel Canyon, right near where they lived a year earlier. It was, that's a real curious one. And I think if I had more time and more energy and really wanted to do it, I would try to do some deep delving into who George Peters really was and what his whole agenda really might have been. And I have some guesswork in my book, but beyond that, I can't really say anything. Just kind of a little suspect. Another person who a little odd background, and in the book is Emmanuel Trujillo. Emmanuel Trujillo, who founded the Peyote Way Church of God. And this is a guy with a real colorful and wild life, who I think was the first person to take peyote out of the Native American context and put it in a sacred organization based on its usage and get away with it legally. And I get into his story and the group's story there. They're still around. They're in Arizona. They take people out there on retreats to use powdered. They consume powdered peyote in water and have an overnight thing out there in the desert. And they're an interesting group too. And he's another person who's very colorful and somewhat sinister background.
So what were some examples of some of the things you did in the past book-wise? I mean, I obviously don't want to get into them too deeply, but just I'm kind of curious of the evolution of what you were writing before to this.
Well, the first book I wrote and self-published way back in the beginning of desktop publishing and laser printing era in the late 80s when I was a young man was Mysterious California. That was sort of a guidebook to all the bizarre and eerie and strange places in my beloved home state. That was quite an experience, not just writing it and doing the research for it, but bringing it out really at the dawn of effective self-publishing and actually selling 10,000 copies of it, which was pretty good for the shoestring operation I had. That was followed years later by a book based on it and other stuff called Weird California. I co-wrote it with two other gentlemen, Joe Osterly and Greg Bishop, and it was published on Sterling Press, which is the imprint of Barnes and Noble. Then I had California Jesus, which again, continuing the local lore and weirdness theme of my writing career. I looked at the Christian sects and evangelists that had either settled in or come out of the state, and that again really got into some what I think were very interesting stories there, ranging from the life and career of Amy Semple McPherson, who was really, I think, pretty much not started Pentecostalism, but spread it worldwide, and really was the first woman doing this sort of really public evangelization and ministerial work in the United States, and first one to have a radio station. She pioneered media evangelizing through communications media, all the way down to really strange and odd little groups that were in California that consider themselves, well, we are Christian, and this is the iteration of that ancient and huge faith that has been influenced by the culture and history of the state. I guess another example I had in there would have been Gene Scott, who was inescapable on cable TV for many years. Very colorful and wild preacher. And then I got into other things as well. Then there was a new edition of Mysterious California, which was titled Eerie California, which didn't come out so well, and I don't want to discuss that. So really, though, it was all really leading up to psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, something I've been fascinated with for decades, had all sorts of information that had not really been put together before and put into a book. And I got to Inner Traditions, which is a really great publisher on metaphysical and unusual subjects to take it on, and they've been very supportive and did a really nice job with the physical book.
Did us some very unique guests for many years. So many years, I've lost count. Like 10 at least. We've had a lot of their guests.
Yeah.
You know Cristo Rupolo, Curse of the Man That Sees UFOs? You ever see that? Monterey, California?
I've heard the name. I'm not really too much into the UFO phenomenon. My friend Adam Gorightly and then my co-author on Weird California, Greg Bishop, are real experts on that. They've really followed it very closely. It's been kind of a lesson for me.
I've interviewed both of them. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Monterey, he gets a lot of footage up there that's crazy good of UFO stuff and that documentary. What are you eyeballing in the future to do?
Well, I mentioned possible biography of Jefferson Poland, who I mentioned earlier, who, as I said, is just this great and figure about of the 60s counterculture and the new left political movements and the civil rights movement and all this other stuff, and the early lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, et cetera, movement, who's never really had a proper biography done of him. And there's lots of stuff out there. This guy was like the Zelig of the 60s and early 70s, really. He was just in all these different things. Possibly, there's other stuff I'm entertaining as well. Don't really want to talk about it too much.
And do you ever get any of these places not wanting you to talk about them? Any of these religions, like, oh, don't talk about that, but they don't care. They're pretty much open to it.
So far, no. A couple of them have said, well, you got this, written me and said, well, you got this detail wrong or that or whatever. And I said, okay, I'll correct it if a new edition comes out. Ann Armstrong kind of took me to task for one thing I said about her ministerial status. I said, she's unrecognized by the Roman Catholic Church. And she says, no, I am. They've sent me letters saying, yeah, we recognize you as a minister. And I said, well, I should have said in the church hierarchy, because you're a girl, they're not going to accept you. But other than that, it's so far no real blowback from any of it. I think a lot of these groups like it that somebody went out there and publicized it and got it into a book. That it's not just some flickering website screen or some ephemeral news story, but this is a permanent document of their history and their activities and their beliefs and the particular kind of crap that they've gone through.
Graham, have you had any run-ins with any of these psychedelic cults?
What do you mean run-ins?
Partying. I'm just kidding. Have you had any interaction?
Well, I've not personally interacted with any of these groups. I mean, my experience with drugs or psychoactive chemicals and religious groups or spiritual groups have been more, certainly there's among certain Ausatra groups, Northern European groups, there's a very active attempt to reclaim certain chemicals, herbs, mushrooms, certain types of alcoholic beverages that were used with herbs. Cannabis was also used. Cannabis has been used everywhere. So, in order to sort of recreate certain traditional visionary practices. I know that there are subgroups within the Troth, for example, who do this. I've talked to some of them. Some of it they have to be careful with because Amanita can be quite toxic.
Mm-hmm.
Fly agaric can be quite toxic. Belladonna can be quite toxic. So, sort of learning how to use and not use certain aspects of those drugs is a big part of what they're working on. So, I mean, that's all that I've been more interested in psychedelics or psychotropic drugs as a part of as aspects of therapy, medicinals, and so I've done some work with Sufi healers who have always sparingly used various substances in order for certain types of healing, both physical and psychological. And they've often drawn on the pharmacopoeia of China and India for that.
Yes.
So that's kind of where I've gone with it. I mean, I've had my own experiments with certain psychedelics, but like cannabis, for example, I don't really like cannabis. And unless I can eat it, I don't get much out of smoking it. It's never really done anything for me. It just gives me a headache. So I, or if I have an effect from it, I like giggle for 45 minutes, pass out, and wake up with a hangover. It's just not really, doesn't do much for me personally, but I know people that use it for a variety of reasons, and it's like whatever. I have had my best success with psilocybin.
Yes.
That's probably what I have had real acid a couple of times.
Yeah.
But it just lasted too long. It's kind of like after about 6 hours, I'm kind of done. It's like
it was more like it's just too much like speed. I'm just like that, and it's not opening the brain the same way psilocybin would, in the way which I really liked with that.
Yeah, right. I mean, for me, the difference is on psilocybin. It's in the first place, it's gentler, and for me, it's gentler, and if you have to suddenly act straight, you can. You know what I mean? It's like, I wouldn't recommend driving on it, but but in other words, if something happens, you can cope with it. Whereas with acid, at least for me, the first time I took it, it was under very controlled conditions. I had a friend with me. He was guiding me on this trip. I was actually doing it for a specific purpose, I thought, and I ended up spending, I don't know, it was something like 8 hours staring at a Mandelbrot revolving fractal pattern on his computer, listening to the same Billie Holiday songs over and over again. And I kind of came out of that, and I was starving. That's kind of what my experience was. I didn't have any and it wouldn't go away. It's 12 hours later, I had to go to work, and I was like, it was a physical job, and I realized I was still high, and it was like, I need to work. It's so, yeah.
Last time I did it, it was just a very Dionysian experience. I took it at a big neo-pagan festival back east, and spent the night dancing along with everybody else, dancing naked around a bonfire, and stayed up all night because of the stimulating aspects.
Right,
but as far as any real breakthroughs or anything, no.
Right. Yeah. But with the psilocybin, I actually had insights, and it helped me with for many years in my life, I had a depression, really bad depression.
Yep.
And it actually helped me sort of get a handle on it, to the point where eventually I was able to sort of, I think, help myself more permanently.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to reprogram certain aspects of myself in a way that, now I for a while I was on, prescription psychotropic drugs.
Yeah.
And I'm not now, and don't have to be. So I attribute at least part of that to, I've done other work too, but I attribute at least part of that to sort of the breakthrough experiences. There's something about those experiences that helped me kind of break through certain mental cycles that I like, tape loops, I guess is the best way for me to put it, that I just couldn't quite do on my own. And that's where I think it might be useful for some people, not for everyone, but for
I would
some
agree.
people.
Yeah. I was like, again, I'm going to quote Hunter S. Thompson, he was talking about LSD. He said it changes you at the place of definition. And yeah, if you can redefine who you are, what you're doing here, where you're going, what your relations are with other people, what your relationship is with the earth and with animals and whatnot, yeah, it's, that whole reprogramming experience can be quite healing if you know what you're doing and
Right.
and are mindful.
Well, and like I said, these were this was always done under a very controlled situation, within
Yeah.
within certain contexts. And in fact, the last couple times that I've used psilocybin mushrooms, I've actually used them as part of ritual, so kind of a ceremony,
Yeah.
ceremonial context, and as part of the reframing, and for me, that makes sense, because that's kind of why people originally used them to begin with. So,
as I said earlier, it's sacred. The context is sacred, and that makes, I think, all the difference there.
There was an acid that was like the uncle of it that I did not too long ago that was shorter. I think it was like 2 hours. I like that. I like that they're making it shorter.
Yeah, well, they're doing the microdosing right now, where you get much smaller doses than you would in a full one, and that apparently is very popular around Silicon Valley. All these highfalutin venture capitalists and computer programmers and whatnot say that gives them insights and they can focus in interesting ways and I have some problems with that, because to me that's just you're just using it to enhance your regular life. You're not really trying to break through. You're not trying to improve yourself into anything beyond, I can make more money doing this. That's it's become kind of a media stereotype, and of course it was in the news a lot recently. But Burning Man, I went for several years in the early 2000s, and what it has become now is so dominated by people in that industry or people in entertainment who just want a week-long party. And yeah, that's fine if you want a week-long party, but there's more to it. There's a little more going on here. There's something more transformative than just, having your little bacchanalian break, and then going back to your whatever job and life you had before, and basically being the same person doing the same things. Again, not trying to be judgmental here. I'm just saying that that's kind of a very limited use of the tool, and of the substance, of the medicine.
Any of these places gone online meetings, mail order system?
Yeah.
Not yet. The dark web. I'm scared to go there. I've never been there. So.
I refuse to go there.
Me too.
I'm sure I would stumble on, a bit of child porn or a bit of a piece of a snuff film or something. And
I would piss someone off, and they would do that to me. That's exactly.
I would freak out if I encountered something like that.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm pretty thick-skinned, but there's some stuff that gets under that thick armor.
Gross, for sure.
Yeah.
And then just the way that stuff. I've heard people talk about it. The Silk Road and all that. It's just kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Some of that stuff.
We live in a strange, wild time, and I just say I'd like to stick around long enough to see what's next. What craziness will the universe and the human race throw at me next to deal with? And just treat it like a big adventure. And one more quote, one of my great influences, the late James Douglas Morrison, who said, "The future's uncertain and the end is always near." And that's I live by that.
Well, we know how life actually ends. So
yeah.
So the way you don't have to worry about that, it's like.
Yeah. I lost my fear of death long ago. I just figured this is just part of being a sentient being on this planet. We've got so many years, and why fear it? Why feel like it's bad or something. This is just, there's life, there's death. Maybe there's something beyond that. I don't know. I'm a transcendental agnostic. I do not know. I don't know if it's possible to know until you're actually going through it. If you go through it, I mean, I'm very meta in that way. Robert Anton Wilson was a big influence on my thinking there, as far as just the power of maybe, the power of just not saying yes or no, but just maintaining kind of a suspicion or about what may be out there, what this may all be about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I tend to believe there, because of some of my experiences, there's something, but what it is and whether it's me as I understand that going through it, that I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. I tend to believe that that whatever life is as consciousness, if the universe is consciousness, that there is some continuum there. Yeah. But whether it's a form I'd recognize, that's another thing entirely.
And I always come back to the allegory or parable of the blind man and the elephant. You know, you've got one blind man grabbing onto the trunk and saying, "Well, it's long and thin," and the other one grabbing onto the one of the feet and saying, "No, it's thick and strong and it's got these nails on it," and another one, you know, with his hand of his butt and saying, "Oh, it's terrible. It's all shit." Blah 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 blah. The reason I'm fascinated by comparative religion is because I'm listening to the different testimonies of the blind man at different parts of the elephant, trying to figure out, well, what is this that they're all trying to describe? Put them all together and see what is out there.
Yeah, one of my big experiences has been seeing beings of light with my naked eye. I've seen them sober. I've seen them while partying. I've seen them with witnesses. I think that somehow is the Creator, Great Spirit showing me, so I'll be less afraid. But I'm still scared shitless of it for some reason. Like, I think there's something to the glowy beings, though. Like, that's us. Like luminous beings in shamanism. I think that's us. But just, like Cocoon, Ron Howard, baby.
It's coming up against that can be frightening. I mean, look at all in the Holy Bible. Look at all the tales of people encountering angels and being terrified of what they were experiencing. It's something that's, whatever it is, it's a lot bigger than ourselves, and we just deal with it the way we can.
Definitely. Well, we got like 2 minutes. What do you have a website you'd like to share? And people are asking the best place to buy the book.
Okay, best place to buy the book is on Amazon. Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. Just bang that into the book search and it'll come up. I'm also on Instagram. Look for Psychedelic Cults, one word, on Instagram. Those are probably the best ways to get at the book and get at me. I'm sure that if people call in and give you their contact information and you pass it on to me, I might be able to get back at them that way. I do like hearing from people and getting their feedback. But since we're almost out of time, I guess, Jeffrey, I'd like to thank you for having me on. Wham, thank you for your very intelligent and insightful commentary.
And thanks, Inner Traditions.
Thank you for a good book.
Okay.
All right.
I'm glad you guys enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners enjoyed as well.
All right, everybody. I've been binging Justified. I'm like a granny watching soaps. I'm binging it so hard. With it's a good show. They had Justified Primeval, a new, like, I guess a spinoff of it come out. So I've never watched the original. It's like Kentucky, U.S. Mar. It's like a Wild West, but in modern times. Yeah. It's good. Walton Goggins kills it in that.
Oh, there's a quote from it that's so wonderful. The Rayford, the guy who the hero is talking to some guy, and he's saying, he's saying, you know, there's this old saying: you get up in the morning and you go out, you run into an asshole. Well, you ran into an asshole. If you get up in the morning, you go out and you're running into nothing but assholes, guess what? You're the asshole.
The asshole. I just heard that not too long ago.
That is folk wisdom if there ever was any.
They got to be good for me to binge like that. I've done 6 seasons in a month, I think. So I'm at the tail end. Now Sam Elliott. Got Sam Elliott in the last one.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
cool.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
But all right, everybody.
All
I
right.
appreciate it, Mike. Thanks, Wham. Thanks,
Take it
everybody.
easy.
We'll see you next Friday with Sarah Frazetta. We're going to Legacy of Frank Frazetta.
Okay.
Everybody have a good weekend.
Take care, folks.
Have a great weekend.
All right.
Goodbye. Good night, everybody. Hold on. Let me...
Looking for stories that are fresh and new? Dark fantasy, humor, space exploration, time travel, cyberpunk, alternate history, and more. They're in the L. Ron Hubbard Presents Writers of the Future anthology. From 24 award-winning authors and illustrators, plus art and writing tips and bonus stories. L. Ron Hubbard Presents Writers of the Future. Buy your copy at galaxypress.com, Amazon, or wherever books are sold.